Dylan Turner was supposed to be the proud graduate walking across the stage, and Melissa Turner, his stepmother, was supposed to be the smiling parent cheering from the crowd. Instead, their names became forever linked in tragedy when a single gunshot inside a crowded high school gymnasium turned celebration into chaos. The gymnasium at Lincoln High was decorated with banners, balloons, and flowers. Rows of folding chairs filled the polished wooden floor, where families sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for their children to walk across the stage. It was the day everyone had worked toward for years: graduation. The air buzzed with excitement, the kind of restless energy that builds when hundreds of proud parents, siblings, and friends gather to cheer for the same moment. Teachers lined the sides of the stage, smiling at the soon-to-be graduates. Camera flashes lit the room like sparks, and each name called over the microphone brought another round of applause. The students, dressed in blue gowns and square caps, shuffled forward one by one. Some waved to the crowd, others clutched their diplomas tightly, fighting back tears of relief. From the bleachers, the sound of cheering echoed, bouncing off the high ceiling. Families waved signs, balloons floated upward, and phones were raised to capture the milestone. It seemed like nothing could ruin such a perfect day. Melissa Turner sat among the families near the center section of the bleachers, dressed in a white summer dress that stood out against the sea of darker colors. Her smile was wide as she leaned forward, eyes fixed on the stage, waiting for her stepson's name to be called. To those around her, she looked every bit the proud parent, clapping politely for every graduate. No one could have guessed she had less than an hour left to live. As the ceremony moved forward, a tall figure appeared at the back of the gym. Some parents noticed him slipping inside, but no one paid much attention. Guests were constantly entering and leaving, and the ushers waved him through without question. The figure moved with purpose, weaving between the rows of families, his eyes locked on the bleachers where Melissa sat. He carried something in his jacket hidden from sight. The band played softly between names, a cheerful tune that kept spirits high. Melissa laughed with the family seated next to her, unaware of the danger closing in. Nearby, a cluster of students pointed at balloons tied to the railings and whispered about after-party plans. The mood was light, joyful, and completely unprepared for violence. Then came the moment that would shatter everything. A sharp crack echoed through the gym, louder than the music, louder than the applause. For a split second, no one understood what had happened. People thought it was a balloon popping, maybe even part of the band's percussion. But when Melissa collapsed forward, her hands clutching her chest, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The white dress she wore bloomed with red, spreading in seconds. Screams filled the room as people ducked, parents grabbed their children, and chaos erupted. Graduates froze on stage, some dropping their diplomas, others fleeing toward the exits. The sound of chairs scraping the floor mixed with the cries of panic. All eyes turned toward the shooter. It was Dylan Turner, Melissa's own stepson, standing rigid, the weapon still in his hands. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the scene felt unreal, as though time had slowed, but the devastation was all too real. What had begun as a day of celebration was now forever marked by tragedy. The hours following the shooting left the town of Lincoln in shock. News crews swarmed the school parking lot, parents huddled together, and students wept in their caps and gowns. While the chaos of that day lingered in people's memories, detectives had already begun piecing together the story behind the violence. They turned their attention to the Turner household, hoping the roots of the tragedy could be found within its walls. What they uncovered painted a portrait of a family that had never fully healed. Dylan Turner had been only 16 when his mother passed away after a long illness. Friends remembered the boy as quiet and withdrawn even before her death, but afterward he seemed to shut down completely. His father, Mark Turner, had struggled as well. He juggled grief with the responsibilities of raising a teenage son, and for years the two lived in a house that felt more like a shadow of their past than a home. 2 years later, Mark met Melissa. She was warm, outgoing, and determined to bring joy back into the Turner household. She encouraged family dinners, painted the living room a brighter color, and tried to include Dylan in everything she planned. To outsiders, it looked as if she had succeeded. Neighbors often saw the family mowing the lawn together or loading up the car for weekend trips, but appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, tension grew. Dylan never accepted Melissa as part of his life. He resented the way she rearranged furniture, changed family traditions, and softened his father's sharp edges. To him, she was not a partner for his dad, but an intruder who had erased his mother's memory. Friends recalled how Dylan would avoid going home, spending hours alone at the park or wandering aimlessly around town. Teachers noticed his slipping grades, but when they asked about his home life, he shrugged them off. At family gatherings, relatives recalled strained silences and sudden outbursts. Dylan often kept his distance, sitting alone while Melissa tried to bridge the gap with kind words that went unanswered. Mark, caught between his wife and his son, struggled to hold the pieces together. He insisted they were a family, but his attempts only deepened Dylan's sense of isolation. By the time Dylan approached his senior year, the divide was unmistakable. Melissa tried to celebrate his small achievements, like making it to class on time or passing a test, but Dylan saw these gestures as empty. When she encouraged him to think about college, he refused to discuss it. When she mentioned applying for jobs, he turned cold. He believed she was trying to control him, to reshape him into something that fit her vision of a perfect family. The final months before graduation were the most telling. Neighbors reported loud arguments spilling out of the house at night. Doors slamming so hard, the sound carried across the street. Melissa's friends confided that she felt unwanted and feared Dylan would never forgive her for marrying his father. Still, she held on to hope that the graduation ceremony might be a turning point, a chance for Dylan to feel supported by his family. She could not have known that Dylan's feelings had hardened into something dangerous, something far beyond teenage resentment. While Melissa looked forward to celebrating his future, Dylan had already chosen to destroy it. When detectives searched Dylan Turner's bedroom, they expected to find school books, clothes, and the usual clutter of a teenager's life. Instead, they uncovered something far more disturbing. Tucked beneath his bed was a shoebox filled with videotapes, each carefully labeled with dates stretching back nearly a year. Alongside them sat a small handheld camcorder, its battery drained but still functional. The discovery immediately shifted the direction of the investigation. What could a teenager be documenting so obsessively, and why hide it away from everyone else? At the police station, the tapes were played one by one. The first few seemed harmless, showing Dylan filming the family's backyard, the neighborhood streets, and even the family dog. But as the dates moved forward, the recordings grew darker. He had begun following Melissa around the house with his camera. Sometimes the footage showed her folding laundry in the living room, cooking dinner in the kitchen, or sitting on the couch with a book. None of it appeared to be filmed with her knowledge. The closer the detectives looked, the clearer it became that Dylan had been spying on his stepmother for months. What unsettled investigators most were the whispered comments caught on the audio track. Dylan's voice, low and cold, could be heard muttering about how she didn't belong, how she was ruining his family, and how everything had been better before she arrived. In one tape, he zoomed in on a framed photograph of Melissa smiling beside Mark, then slowly dragged a marker across her face, scratching it out while the camera continued to roll. His quiet breathing in the background was almost more chilling than the act itself. The recordings escalated over time. In later videos, Dylan positioned the camera in hidden spots around the house. He filmed Melissa washing dishes, making phone calls, and once even sleeping on the couch late at night. The obsession was undeniable. He was cataloging her every move, as though building a case against her in his own mind. Detectives began to see this not as simple resentment, but as a fixation growing into something dangerous. One particular tape stood out. It was filmed in the weeks leading up to graduation. Dylan recorded himself pacing his bedroom, the camera pointed at the floor. His voice, though muffled, revealed a storm of anger. He spoke about endings, about making a statement, about ensuring Melissa would never be part of their family again. His words were not direct threats, but they carried enough menace to send chills through the room of seasoned investigators. The discovery of these tapes turned the case from a tragic act of violence into something far more deliberate. Dylan had not acted out of sudden rage. He had been building toward this moment for a long time, documenting his growing hatred as if rehearsing for the crime he would eventually commit. Every frame of those recordings pulled detectives deeper into the mind of a teenager consumed by obsession. The question that lingered, however, was why he chose such a public stage. He could have lashed out in private, yet he waited until the graduation ceremony in front of hundreds of witnesses to carry out his attack. To investigators, that decision hinted at a motive far more complex than anyone first imagined. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives gained access to Dylan's computer. At first, they expected to find little more than school assignments, music files, or social media accounts. What they uncovered instead was a hidden folder buried deep inside his hard drive. The folder contained dozens of text documents, each one dated and saved like entries in a diary. Unlike the tapes, which showed Dylan's growing fixation from the outside, these writings revealed the disturbing landscape of his mind. The journals began months before the shooting. The earliest entries were filled with bitterness. He wrote about how Melissa had invaded his life, how she had replaced his mother's memory, and how his father no longer seemed like the man he once knew. Each entry grew more venomous, dripping with a sense of betrayal. Dylan described family dinners where Melissa asked about his day, claiming she was pretending to care. He described watching her move furniture or change curtains, calling her small acts of normalcy, erasing everything that used to matter. But the writings soon turned darker. Dylan began describing plans, not in precise detail, but in vague, chilling terms. He wrote about making her pay and ensuring that she never ruins another day of my life. His words revealed a young man who no longer saw Melissa as human, but as a symbol of everything he felt he had lost. He was rewriting the narrative of his family in his mind, casting himself as the victim and her as the villain. One entry stood out from the rest, dated just 2 weeks before graduation. Dylan wrote that Melissa had been arguing with his father late at night. He claimed she planned to leave the marriage and take his younger step-siblings with her. Investigators could not confirm whether this was true or simply Dylan's twisted interpretation, but to him, it was enough. In his mind, this meant she wasn't just an intruder, she was a destroyer. He believed she had come into his life only to dismantle what little family he had left. The entry ended with a haunting line. Graduation is the last time we will all be together. She thinks it's about me, but it's really about her. That single sentence reframed the entire tragedy. Dylan had chosen the most public, celebratory moment of his life to stage Melissa's death. He wanted the act to be unforgettable, a spectacle that would permanently scar everyone who had ever supported her. It was not a crime of passion, but one of cold design. The more investigators read, the clearer the motive became. Dylan's resentment had festered for years, transforming into obsession and finally into a carefully constructed plan. He wanted the shooting to be symbolic, a brutal message to his father and to anyone who thought Melissa belonged in their family. By ending her life in front of hundreds of people, he ensured that his version of the story, the one where Melissa was cast as the villain, would live on. These journal entries stripped away any doubt about Dylan's intent. They showed not only his hatred, but also his desire for spectacle. his hunger to make Melissa's death more than just a private act. It was this evidence, combined with the tapes, that convinced prosecutors they were dealing with premeditated murder. Dylan Turner had not simply snapped. He had written, planned, and executed his crime with chilling precision. The courtroom was silent when Dylan Turner was brought in for trial. Reporters filled every seat, their cameras waiting for a glimpse of the teenager who had turned a day of celebration into a scene of horror. Families of graduates sat alongside Melissa's relatives, their faces marked with grief. The jurors, carefully chosen after days of questioning, shifted uneasily in their seats. Everyone in the room wanted to understand how a young man could commit such an act in front of hundreds of witnesses. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision. They began with the tapes, showing clips of Dylan's hidden recordings to the jury. The footage of Melissa unaware she was being watched left the courtroom unsettled. Some jurors looked away as the scratched-out photographs were projected on the screen, the marker lines black against Melissa's smiling face. Then came the journal entries. The prosecutors read Dylan's words aloud, letting the jury hear the chilling sentences that revealed his thoughts in the weeks leading up to graduation. The entries about making her pay and ending it during the last time we are together painted a picture of a calculated killer, not an impulsive teenager. The defense attempted to argue that Dylan was mentally unstable, too lost in grief from his mother's death to understand the weight of his actions. They pointed to his isolation, his poor academic performance, and his lack of close friends as signs of a troubled mind. They asked the jury to see him as a broken boy rather than a murderer. But the evidence was overwhelming. The videos, the journals, and the choice of such a public setting all pointed to one undeniable truth. Dylan had planned this crime carefully, step by step. When the verdict was read, the courtroom held its breath. The jury found Dylan Turner guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dylan stood without reaction, his eyes fixed on the floor, his face pale and unreadable. He did not look at Melissa's family, nor did he speak on his own behalf. For many, his silence was as chilling as his crime. The aftermath of the tragedy extended far beyond the courtroom. Lincoln High changed the way it conducted ceremonies, adding security checks at the doors and stationing officers at every event. For years afterward, the graduating class would hold a moment of silence to remember Melissa, the woman whose life had been taken in a place meant for joy. Her family described her as patient, kind, and hopeful. Someone who believed even Dylan could grow past his anger. Her absence left a void that could never be filled. In the community, the shooting became a haunting reminder of how hidden resentments can fester. Parents wondered if they truly knew what their children were feeling. Teachers questioned whether signs of danger had been overlooked, and neighbors spoke of the eerie quiet that had always surrounded Dylan. The story spread beyond the town, covered by national outlets, each headline capturing the shock of a son turning on his stepmother in such a public and brutal way. In prison, Dylan faded from public view. There were no interviews, no letters of apology, no statements of regret. He remained as distant and unreadable as he had been on the day of the shooting. For the community of Lincoln, his silence left an unsettling question lingering in the air. Was he ever truly sorry, or had Melissa always been nothing more than the target of his consuming hatred? The legacy of that day lived on not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson. It revealed how grief can twist into rage, how obsession can grow unnoticed, and how the most ordinary events can turn into nightmares when anger is left unchecked. Graduation at Lincoln High would never again be just about celebration. It would always carry the shadow of Melissa Turner's death and the haunting memory of the young man who ended her life.